Hello, I'm Kirstyn.
And I'm Nicholas. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
In 3, 2, 1.
Oh, can't wait to edit that out. The scene is set. You sit quietly, deep in the woods, the sounds of society long since past, unable to penetrate the thick, deciduous leaves. Surrounded only by the quiet chirping of birds and a gentle breeze through the canopy, everything is still. Suddenly, a massive cracking and tearing rips through the calm as the large tree slams its bulk into the earth. Broken from your trance, you notice the once peaceful forest is blanketed by more fallen giants. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of others stand naked of bark and leaves, awaiting a similar rotting fate. And hello, nerds, what's up? How's it going, Kirstyn?
I am doing very well, and I'm super excited. Do you want to tell everybody why I'm so excited?
Yes, and I'll do so in the form of a question. How's it going, Becca?
Hi, I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on. We're super excited to have you.
I am super hyped. I had my normal amount of coffee today, but it feels like I drank a lot more because this is our first guest. Becca just sat through a painstaking us getting everything set up. And so we would like to first thank her for being a gracious guest. And then we can go ahead and get into the science.
Absolutely. And we should probably have Becca introduce herself and why we're having her on this podcast, right?
Yeah. You want to get started, Becca?
My name is Rebecca Robertson. You can call me Becca, and my pronouns are she, hers. And for the past 3 years, I've worked for the United States Department of Agriculture, researching the phenology and reproductive biology of emerald ash borer and its parasitoids. So I'm really excited today to talk about EAB and all of the parasitoids that we've been using to hopefully reduce its populations in the United States.
Right. This is so exciting. I love everything parasitoid. They are one of just the neatest niches there is out there. Like I thought parasites were cool, and then I started to dabble in entomology, and it was like, wow. Before we really get into it, could you define for us like what a parasitoid is, just in case, because it's a little bit different?
I sure could. So parasitoids are usually wasps, and they're often insects that lay their eggs or larvae inside the other insect. So a parasitoid usually is Hymenoptera, so wasps is what we usually see. I work with 5 different species of wasps at this point, and all of these either lay their eggs inside of the larvae of EAB or the eggs of EAB.
All right, very cool. So it's kind of like a parasite, but they're called parasitoids because it's a different sort of life cycle. It's not what you would label as kind of a common parasite, for sure.
Right, and also parasitoids at the end of their life cycle do kill their host. A good parasite does not kill their host. So that's a big difference there too as well.
Right. Awesome.
So Kirstyn has like a little background in entomology too, right?
A little bit, yeah. So I've done a little bit in La Universidad Católica here in Ecuador, but most of the stuff I was doing was, some stuff on behavior. We had like this really big database, but everything that I've worked on was really general because we had a lot of like immature species and that kind of thing. So we were just kind of IDing the best we could out of this huge, huge database. And then I've done like a little bit with the biology and in that biodiversity, but I definitely would just say dabbled, definitely not an expert like Becca.
I don't know if I could even call myself an expert. Insects are so complicated, and we're always learning new stuff. So I feel like every single day I'm like, oh, well, that's new. I didn't know
right.
That.
Yeah.
That is such a scientist answer to that question. Well, I can't really call myself an expert because we're always learning new things. That's exactly what any biologist.
I feel like that imposter syndrome, like it hits hard too, because you're like, I do know what I'm talking about, but also there's so much I don't know, and it'll always be that way. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of this kind of science.
Right. So typically, I think we usually kind of describe what we're talking about as far as what the emerald ash borer is. But before we get into that, I actually have a few questions for both of you, honestly. So Kirstyn, you're currently, as we know, in Ecuador. Jealous, first off. But You spent a lot of time in Canada, being as that is where you were born. What a weird
Right.
way to phrase that, Nicholas, but we're going to just pass right on through it.
Roll over that one. It's okay.
Do you know, and Becca, maybe you know this as well, because the scope of EAB, is it up in Canada? Is it a problem in Canada? I imagine it wouldn't just be
It is.
restricted to the US because it's pretty dang bad in Northern Illinois. And I definitely have a significant, I wouldn't say experience working directly with the EAB, but working with the recovery post EAB, which will probably come into play later in the discussion.
Yeah, it is in Canada. It's in 4 Canadian provinces right now. And it was also detected there originally when we found them in 2002 in Michigan. So they've been in Canada throughout this entire infestation. But the problem is that some of our parasitoids do not do well in the colder range of EAB. And so it can be a little bit hard to implement biological control in areas where the temperature doesn't really allow for the species to flourish. So we do struggle with that a little bit in Canada.
Fair enough. And those are just in the eastern provinces, if I'm not incorrect.
No, you're right.
Not incorrect. Okay, yeah, fair enough. So I am from the west side of Canada, but definitely had kind
West
of heard
side?
about it. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I wouldn't phrase it like that, but but yeah, so I've definitely heard of it. My knowledge of EAB is quite minor in general, just because I haven't directly worked with it. The most that I had ever really seen it was there was some people doing some really cool macro photography with a bunch of layered things, because it's actually a really beautiful insect.
Isn't it? I think they're gorgeous, which really sucks because they're invasive, but buprestids, which are the jewel beetles, are just so beautiful with that metallic coloration, and it's structural too. So when you take macro photography of these jewel beetles, you get to see all those little structures that create that metallic iridescent shine, which is really beautiful. And I'm trying to get into that right now, but I definitely have a lot to learn. It is very difficult.
Right. Yeah, it's a whole different different category, like trying to get into macro photography for sure, but that's super interesting. Well, everybody will keep an eye on your Instagram for when your first couple ones come out. Those will be in the show notes, guys, so you can follow Becca there. All right, so Nicholas, you have a little bit more experience. Do you want to share just a little anecdote of your experience, and then we'll get into harassing Becca a little bit more about what she does?
Can't wait.
So for those of you who may be listening as your first episode because you're here to listen to Becca talk, I am a restoration ecologist in Northern Illinois, which essentially just means that I take care of the plants and animals that are here by removing primarily the invasive and non-native species. That's where the bulk of my work lies is invasive species removal. In about 2014, we had the emerald ash borer rip through our forests, and it attacks obviously the deciduous ash trees, which are the bulk of the trees that are up in Northern Illinois. Basically, in our woodlands, at least our disturbed woodlands, all you're getting are maybe some oaks, maples, and ash trees because they grow very quickly and they can outcompete other trees and things like that. And that's also not including the invasive honeysuckle and buckthorn, which are also very prevalent up here. So essentially, you get this massive havoc being wreaked on the ash population. But then what we're seeing now is potentially some potential secondary effects from the EAB ripping through. And it could be that these massive oak trees that have been here for 200 years didn't necessarily have to put up with the wind strength that was hitting them directly because they had a bunch of ash trees protecting them. And now with those ash trees removed, I'm noticing in my woodlands a lot of big limbs and just entire oak trees are just being blown completely over or ripped in pieces. And there's no blight associated with it. They're not rotting or dying, and they don't seem that they're at the end of their life cycle to be dying off naturally. So there's some other effect happening on them. And in those woodlands, all of the ash trees that were affected with the EAB years ago are now just starting to finally rot their root systems and fall over, which is really opening up these woodlands. They went from very, very dense vegetation to very open and, in this case, disturbed woodlands, which of course opens to more invasives to establish while also possibly wiping out these oaks. So I have a very negative relationship with the EAB, just like probably everybody else does, but they are really pretty. That's the only thing. They are gorgeous. However, if you need a jeweled bright green beetle fix consider maybe like a six-spotted tiger beetle, which is arguably more pretty and native.
And their life cycle is really cool. That's actually very interesting that you bring that up, because our lab has not started to explore the effects of like downed ash trees in forests and what happens to the ecosystem after the ash is gone. But I'm not surprised that you're seeing some secondary effects, because I think we're going to see a lot of that. And then we're also going to see a lot of issues with native biodiversity when it comes to ash specialists that are not EAB and that are native. So that's a very interesting point. I feel like I need to bring that up to my lab.
I was actually going to run this by you like a year ago when we were talking about the EAB, because I remember you were asking me for some pictures of the damage.
Yeah, you sent me great pictures.
Thank you. I had noticed that it was happening, and I had noticed like trends in that, but I haven't seen any research that shows that that could be a thing. I have another question that's somewhat related to that, though, that just popped into my head. And so you said your lab hasn't really done any research on like the secondary effects after the trees fall, but have they looked into like effects that happen with like woodpecker populations and the utilizations
Yes.
of, okay, because that's something I've always wondered about.
Yeah, so woodpeckers love EAB. And when I say they love it, they love it.
I like it a lot.
They go crazy for EAB larvae, and it's a great food source for them, and it's great for us because it's a source of biological control in its own way too. Unfortunately, they start attacking trees usually after they've had a pretty severe infestation, so they don't help save the tree, but they do give us a really good indication of whether or not EAB is present in a site. Because not only do you can see the marks from them feeding, but you can also see that they strip bark. It's called bark blonding, I believe. And so if you see trees with that, you can kind of guess if they are also ash that they may have EAB infested, which helps us scouting for sites to use for releases. So that way we can have more sites in various locations to see whether or not our parasitoids are establishing a population. So yes, we've looked at woodpeckers. They are amazing. They're a huge part of our research, actually.
That is super cool to see those trends. So it's kind of occurring to me now, and it might be too late to make this sound natural, but this is kind of what we do on this podcast. It's very laid back and just conversations with cool people. So could you possibly explain essentially how the EAB kind of, well, first off, break down the emerald ash borer a little bit more specifically, what it is, what it does, and why it's so prolific. And then, of course, we'll break down later, where it's from and management strategies and things like that. But I think it's probably a good idea to establish a baseline for what we're talking about when we all keep referencing the EAB.
Yeah, especially for non-insect people, because, that's an acronym with no meaning. So EAB stands for emerald ash borer. They're called emerald ash borers because they prefer ash and they are emerald.
That makes sense to me.
So it's a very nice, easy name. EAB belong to the family Buprestidae, which are jewel beetles. They all get their name from that shiny, beautiful metallic coloration that they have. Right, so EAB is invasive largely because they don't have natural predators. We have a lot of ash that do not have resistance to EAB, and so they're not prepared to deal with this type of a predator. And then on top of that, they don't have any parasitoids that attack them specifically in the US. So we had to introduce these parasitoids in an attempt to biologically control them because chemical control is not feasible for such a large-scale damaging insect. It's not cost-effective, and also I don't know who we would pay to be like, hey, go inject a bunch of trees. That'll be your whole job every single day. I think you'd have to pay a lot of money to motivate someone to do that. So it's just not cost effective for us.
You would be surprised at how little they pay you to do that out here.
Oh, no, I'm not surprised at all. Unfortunately, the nature of those kinds of jobs is just they take whoever they can get and they pay them very little, which is sad because it's crucial work. But the larvae themselves are what's damaging. It's not the beetle. The beetle feeds on ash leaves, and they really don't do much to the tree as adults. But the larvae burrow into the wood right under the bark, and they're in the phloem, and that's what they feed on. What Nick sent me before were actually these pictures of their galleries, which are the grooves that they create under the wood. And these galleries are full of frass or insect poo. That's just a fancy term for that. And that's how you can determine whether or not EAB is in a tree. If you start peeling away the bark and you see all these galleries, well, you can be pretty sure it was EAB. The larvae themselves are very flat. They're serrated, so they have these kind of like triangle-shaped body segments, and that allows them to kind of wiggle through the wood as they eat. Mm-hmm. They have a head capsule that has mandibles that they use to digest the wood, and then their abdomen or rear end of their larval form is kind of blah and boring. They're a gross yellowy color, yellowish white. And they get fairly large. They have 4 larval instars until they reach that point where they want to pupate. When they pupate, they dig deeper into the wood. They form what's called a JL larval, which is when they form a literal J with their body. And then they form into the pupa. They wait a couple of weeks, and then when they're ready, they emerge as adults.
Right, so they're like the ugly duckling of beetles, maybe.
They sure are. That is a great way to put it.
Perfect.
The larvae are so ugly, and the beetles are beautiful. They just become a beautiful, beautiful beetle. It just takes them a couple weeks.
Right. I think you'd be hard pressed maybe to go ahead and find a beetle larva that's like beautiful though as well. So, but maybe just because these ones get so pretty. Oh, okay. There we go.
There's a family of beetles, Drillinae. I think it's a tribe now. It used to be a family, but they have beautiful larvae. I highly recommend you look them up. They're like a bright orangey red color, and they're huge. Well, and I like big bugs, so the bigger the better. I like big bugs. And I cannot lie. But, that's not everyone's cup of tea. I know that.
Right. You heard it here first, folks.
I like big bugs, and I cannot lie.
Perfect.
So you had mentioned instars. I don't think we've necessarily broke down like insect life cycles. I don't think we've actually done an episode on insects other than ants at this point.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I don't dumb down my terms.
No,
it's totally fine.
Mm-hmm. No, we prefer to do... Oh, sorry. I totally cut you off. No, we prefer just to tell people, and then you can go ahead and explain it afterwards.
Okay, good. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
So instars are larval stages, and basically what an instar is between molts. So there's L1, which is the first instar, L2, which is the second instar, L3, which is the third, and L4, which is the fourth. And that's just delineated by every time they molt their exoskeleton.
Right. And different insects have different numbers of instars.
Yes, and they all have different forms as they grow. So some have like a nymphal stage where they look pretty much like the adult, just smaller and without wings. EAB is different in that it has complete metamorphosis. So its larvae looks completely different from the adult, and they have different niches that they occupy.
Right, for sure. Awesome. Yeah, that's good. So, I think most of us that don't study insects are pretty familiar with that. Most have those 4 life stages, but then within the larval stage, there's all these stages as well, which are the instars. Yeah. So it gets you can always go deeper and deeper, and it gets more complex as you go.
Exactly, especially with insects. I feel like there's no end to how much deeper you can go.
Right. Exactly.
Because the 2 most common life cycles are the complete and the incomplete, and the incomplete is egg, pupa, adult,
nymph,
and then the complete is egg, nymph, larva, adult.
Yeah, so for complete it's egg, larvae, pupa, adult. For incomplete,
I've mixed them up.
It's okay. It's egg, nymph, adult. They don't tend to pupate it. It's incomplete.
Right. I should know this.
The young a little bit differently. Instead of larvae, they're nymphs. But entomologists tend to kind of use the terms intermittently, so don't beat yourself up.
Oh, that's
just
okay.
Like we call things bugs, but they're not bugs. We know, but we like them.
Unless they're in the true bug family, and then it's the same thing with all sciences. There's like the colloquialisms and things like that are adapted, and then and then there's some elitist scientists who are like, well, technically, and
right.
Always fun.
I'm definitely not one of the elitists. I mean, I know that there are proper terms, but I call bugs because it's cute and they're cute. So I'll keep it up.
Yeah, perfect. So for you as an instant transition, but for us, we had to switch into another Zoom meeting. And during that time period, I realized why I'm dumb and why I should have known the life stages of insects. One, because it's on an herbicide exam, and that's something that I need to know regularly. But more importantly, what I'm more upset about, and I'm outing myself as a nerd here, is that if you go to the Pokemon world, they have eggs, and then they have their evolutions, and out of an egg will hatch a Larvitar, and that evolves into Pupitar, and then evolves into Tyranitar, which is the adult phase. So if I was a good nerd, I would have remembered that. So that's why I'm upset, because my Pokemon knowledge failed me.
Did you know that Pokemon was actually started because of someone who liked to collect insects and wanted to make a game? based off that. I just want to throw that out there that you have entomologists to thank for Pokemon. You're welcome.
I'm so
God.
excited about that fact. That makes me so happy for some reason. I don't know
Right?
why, but that just makes me so happy.
On the other side of the coin, you also have entomologists to thank for daylight saving time. So,
Oh, yeah, not a fan of that.
I know. We give you some really great stuff and then some bad stuff, you know?
It's a give and
But
take.
the reason that they did that was because they wanted more time outside to collect insects, which I think is so funny because I really do relate to that.
That is beautiful. Okay, so we've talked about like the life cycle. We've broken down essentially how the emerald ash borer kills trees and why it's such a good pest and why we need to do things to manage it. Could you possibly, maybe, could you maybe give us could you maybe give us some background as to where it's native? Because we really like to explore what the invasive species are like in their native habitat because it gives us a really good comparison. And many times we notice that the pest in a lot of cases is not doing so good in their native habitat because of one reason or another. So we're curious to see what it's like for the emerald ash borer.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in their native range, they're native to China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and parts of Russia and Mongolia. In their range, they're not a pest. They're not even a problem, really. At most, they're a nuisance insect on like ornamental ash trees, but they really don't pose a threat. However, they are spreading from their native range into Ukraine and toward Europe, and that will potentially cause some issues. However, they don't attack every species of ash over there. So they have some safety net in a way, but it's still a cause for concern. But as for being a pest in their native range or their population declining, they're really not seeing either one. They're just kind of remaining constant, hanging out, doing their thing.
Now, is that spreading because of introduction, or is that more of like a neo-native kind of spreading due to climate change?
That's a really
or
good
question. Or do people not know?
Yeah, so from what I've read, my understanding is that it expanded out of its range in Russia and then moved over to Ukraine. Okay. So that could have been through shipping, but they also can fly very far. So it's kind of hard to just say like either or. Personally, I think that they just expanded on their own, but I couldn't tell you one way or another.
Right. I mean, that does make sense, right? Because if they can fly a significant distance, then the only limiting factor would be some sort of climatic reason why they weren't there in the first place. It was not like they would just be like, yeah, you know what? We don't need to go any further.
Like Ukraine, I'm not gonna go. As long as there's hosts available and the climate works for them, they're probably going to take advantage of that habitat, especially if they are experiencing habitat loss in their native range, and I'm sure they are to some degree. So I'm not surprised that they're spreading. I do think that eventually they may be sort of a problem over there, but right now they have reservoir species of ash that don't get impacted by EAB, so they're okay.
Right, okay, so they're just neutral.
Yeah, they're neutral over there.
Yeah.
But over here, oh no, whole different world.
Yeah, they're the aggressor. So that actually transitioned us pretty well into the next question I have for you, which is why is the EAB so successful? Because you did mention that it has all of these adaptations and things like that, but what has made it so that it's so successful over here? And you touched on it a little bit too. I think you mentioned lack of predators and things like that, but maybe you could give us a look at why it's successful because of a lack of predation or something like that, but also perhaps the adaptations that make them just a good invasive. Because as we know, there's tons and tons of non-native species that are introduced all the time, but only some of them become successful for one reason or another. And those are the ones that we really hear about. So there must be something that's not limiting to this specific species.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, like I said before, and like you mentioned, a huge problem is that they don't have natural predators. So parasitoid wasps largely keep this population in check in their native range, and we didn't have any parasitoids that specialized on EAB because they didn't co-evolve with them. So when they were introduced, their populations boomed. Not only that, but they had this whole range of hosts that they could use that had no resistance to them. So they were very excited to be able to use all of those ash trees. They worked very well for them. The reason, though, why they're so prolific and why it took us so long to kind of figure out that they were here is because they're wood-boring insects. So you can't just look at a tree and know that it's infested or dying of EAB until it's often too late. And so we didn't discover that EAB was a problem until probably 10 or 20 years after it was introduced. And that also became an issue of trying to learn how to detect and find them because there was very little published about them prior to this. So we had a lot of learning to do before we could really act. And because they're a wood-boring insect, they're really hard to find. That pairing was detrimental for us. Not only that, but we also harvest ash and cultivate it for ornamental purposes. And so people were using ash and buying them from nurseries and transplanting them and moving them everywhere. But what they didn't know was those nurseries were actually infested with EAB. And so we made it a lot worse. And we didn't mean to. It happens a lot with invasive insects. But because of that, EAB is a huge problem.
Right, yeah, especially like the undetectability is a huge thing. I mean, when we go across we talked, just our last episode was about eucalyptus trees. They're pretty big, they're pretty easy to find, but something that, for 10 years you don't even notice because of the boring. On Instagram for this episode, we'll maybe put some photos up as well of some of the galleries and those kind of things for anybody that wants a bit of a visual, but yeah, that just adds like a whole another layer. And then, by the time it's been 10 or 20 years, must be so difficult to try to get a hold on it, right?
Yeah, well, and they start to die. The trees usually die within 10 years, if not sooner. But even specialists don't always notice when they first infested. Like, for example, they reached Delaware fairly recently, and that's where I live and where I work. However, we didn't realize that they were outside of our lab really until last year. And we already have trees that are dead. So too little, too late kind of thing. And it's nice for us because we can do research right on site now. But we had one tree that they prefer smaller trees because they don't have as good of a defense. But we had one sapling. It had over 145 exit holes from one season. It died. It died real fast. And I think it was only infested probably 2-3 years.
Oh, this would be a great time to talk about what the exit holes look like and how they can be identified.
Yes, so EAB emerged from a D-shaped exit hole, which is very characteristic and makes it very easy to identify once they do start emerging from the trees. And that's one of the things that we use to indicate whether or not they're in a location and also to figure out their emergence phenology. That's something that we're looking at now, and that hasn't really been well studied in their introduced range. We don't know exactly when they start to emerge or what it takes for them to emerge, like degree days and things like that. So we're starting to look at that now so we can have a better idea of when to release parasitoids to be able to impact their introduced populations.
That is actually super fascinating. And I hate to detract from this with this stupid joke I'm about to make. But when she says D-shaped holes, she literally means like the capital letter D, not a penis-shaped hole.
They
just for everyone's reference.
From a penis-shaped hole. They do not. That would be really funny. I feel like I would enjoy my work a lot more if like every day I'm like, whoa, look, the beetle emerged from a penis-shaped hole. But it's just a capital D. That's it.
Yeah. And it is, it's not like one of those things. I feel like a lot of times in science, you'll get like a scientist who says like, oh, it looks exactly like this. And then when you see it in person, you're like, it is not at all. No, every single emergence hole I've ever seen is so easily identifiable because it is a perfect D shape. Could you explain why?
Yeah, so if you look at the beetle themselves, like head on, they're kind of D-shaped in a way. Their head is like flat on the bottom, and then they have a very round top to their head. And they're using those mandibles to dig out a shape that's just big enough for their body to emerge. So it's a D-shaped. That's it.
Super cool.
Right, so it's like about efficiency. Like, why would you cut more space than you actually need, right? When you can just squeeze exactly through.
Happen to need exactly a D shape, which is really easy for us. Now, their parasitoids don't have like a characteristic emergence hole, but when we see trees that are infested with EAB, we can often find emergence holes that we can assume are from their parasitoids, which is really cool too.
Oh, okay.
So you had been talking about, you had mentioned that it's now invasive in Delaware, which actually is interesting to me because if I recall, I think one of the first things that you and I started talking about when we first followed each other on Instagram was probably the mutual hatred of the EAB.
Probably.
Following that, though, I think you told me that they weren't there yet, or at least you hadn't detected them yet, which was only a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. So they were detected technically, but like you weren't seeing stands of trees of ash that were like infested with EAB. And I had never seen adults in Delaware. I didn't see exit holes. And if I did, I had to really, 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 really look. Now it's the point where like once they start emerging, they're flying everywhere. I can see them all around the trees. And people would really be surprised at how efficient flyers they are. It's crazy. When I have to go outside to collect them for our colonies, I'm like, please stop moving. No. Why?
No, God, please, no.
Because they're insanely good at what they do. They're good at traveling. They're good at reproducing. They're good at killing ash trees, unfortunately. So yeah, I was really surprised when we first talked. I never really saw them, and now I can't get away from them.
I think
And
you're underselling.
That's
Go
with
ahead.
releases of parasitoids and stuff too.
Right.
Throw that out
I
there.
think you're underselling how difficult it is to catch these things, because I've tried to catch them for years for identification purposes, so I can get macro pics of them, so I can show people what it looks like. Cannot do it. I probably don't have the resources, but my God, are they like impressive flyers. It's akin to trying to catch a tiger beetle, which I can't do either.
I can do it with my
So-
bare hands.
Ooh.
Humble brag.
I know. Well, hey, it took me a long time to be able to stalk a tiger beetle for it not to jump away. So I'm proud of that one. I really am.
That's
But
like the coolest.
Yeah.
That's like the
It is.
coolest
It
flex
is a
we've
cool
had.
fact.
Yeah,
I'm
it
like,
is.
boom, look at me. But yeah, EAB is really difficult because they are such good flyers, and also ash trees are usually really tall and they like to stay on the foliage. So I'm not a tall person. I'm, 5'4". That's all I got. They don't work with me at all.
I think we're all
I'll
short
just
here.
fly way. Oh, good. Okay, then I don't feel alone. But they're all way above my head, and I've got my giant net, and I'm like running around like a maniac. I feel like people who drive by our lab have to be like, "Whoa, what is wrong with her?"
Do you have one of those like just comedically long extended nets that you use to get canopy stuff?
No,
Because if
only
you
because
do-
they're so expensive. I want one so badly, but I borrow my friends all the time.
I can't imagine that it's that expensive to make a net like that. It's just one of those things where it's like got a very specific purpose, so it's always really expensive.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's so ridiculous because this is completely unrelated, but one of the biggest problems that I noticed in the scientific world is that we get paid nothing. How do we afford stuff?
Well, exactly. And you're also often encouraged to work for free, which is really difficult because you need these supplies to be able to do the work, but you're not getting paid to purchase the supplies.
Right.
So I really encourage like younger people who are scientists, like, yeah, take internships that are unpaid if you're able to, but look for positions where you are paid because that's huge. It's your life. You're valuable. Value yourself. Get paid. Don't do it for free.
Yeah. And it's socially exclusionary to have an unpaid internship because not everybody has the privilege or luxury to be able to do an unpaid internship. So
Exactly.
if a place is offering that, they're basically saying like, we're only taking people who are privileged enough to have enough money to be able to work for free, which is not cool.
Right. And that's the same issue a lot of times with like colleges that offer a senior thesis because you can only do that if you don't have to work all the time. Like I worked 3 jobs in addition to 3 majors. There was no way I was doing a senior thesis. I just couldn't. I couldn't financially afford to do that, which is a shame because it's a huge barrier to a lot of people, especially minority groups. Sorry, I'm going on a tangent now, but like,
No, this is important to talk about.
It seriously is because you can't exclude people from science. Science is for everyone. We all need science.
Yes.
And so putting these financial barriers on science to me is a huge hindrance to what we could have.
Right. And I mean, just to play the devil's advocate, because we have to, a lot of organizations too also struggle to have the funds, like especially in terms of wildlife foundations and those kind of things. I am by no means like saying that this is okay, but this is where we just where we need funding. We need better funding for science and conservation in general, because people shouldn't have to work for free either. But these organizations need to find ways to pay people. So this is just the barrier to everyone to science is just getting better funding from our governments. I hope some people are listening, from our governments, from people that, private institutions. Give your money to science. We need it.
And that's, I think,
well, the
also
government's
partially
always
why-
listening.
Yeah, well, I work for them, technically. But
we all do.
Yeah. We're all government here. But I think also that I lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? That also there's a lot of citizen science projects that are starting now so that they don't have to pay people, but people can get involved. And it's a great way for the general public to care about science and make their own mark.
Perfect. That was a completely unrelated tangent, but a really needed tangent, I think. We haven't had... Yes. We have not had an opportunity to address the fact that social justice is environmental justice. Yes, that's what I meant. So it's something to they're intertwined. They are completely related. So if you care about the environment, then you must care about social justice. So I am not even sorry that we went on that tangent. Thank you, Becca, for leading us into that, actually. So we talked about kind of a few minutes ago just how it wasn't necessarily detected in great quantity in Delaware when you and I were first talking. And we've talked about how I didn't know that it was in Canada. So I think a lot of times we tend to focus on what's in our backyard and not focus on the entire scope of an invasive species. So could you break down on a global scale where the EAB is invasive?
Right. Yeah, I can definitely do that for you. So they're now in 35 states, mostly on the mid and eastern part of the United States. And then they're also in 4 Canadian provinces, the District of Columbia. And then, as I said before, they're also in Ukraine now. Now, whether or not that's really an invasive population is kind of hard to say at this point because that was 2019. It's very recent, but more to come.
Yeah. So do you guys have like projected scope of where it could become invasive? Like, I mean, maybe not your lab specifically, but have you ever looked at any research where it's saying like, okay, it could be introduced here or like potential? Because obviously, actually, I have a really basic question that is probably some question that other people might ask. So obviously, there's multiple species of ash trees. Is that the Fraxus genus?
Fraxinus, yeah.
Fraxinus genus. So I don't know a lot about the Fraxinus genus. Does it affect trees that are not necessarily common name ash trees, perhaps outside of the genus?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked this, actually. So they attack all, I think we have 16 species of ash, so they attack all 16 species that we have in the United States. And then they also attack white fringe tree, which is in the genus Kyananthus. But however, they don't really tend to choose white fringe tree just because it's kind of an alternate host and they don't develop well on it. So they tend to prefer ash. There's also one anecdotal report that said they could be reared on some other species of olive, but I don't know the merit to that. I don't think olive is in any real danger.
Right.
Thank God.
Just because
hopefully it's not autumn olive.
Oh, God.
That would be bad. It'd be like the evil team of 2 species of invasive organisms
working together. It would be nice
working
if you
together.
could just like wipe out autumn olive like that. Just like, no, EAB.
That is true.
Oh, if only.
Right.
That would have been like ideal world.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Perfect. So if you're watching the video now and I'm no longer in it, I apologize. But I promise I'm not doing anything weird. The connection was just slow. So we have talked about pretty much everything that we can talk about regarding the movements of this species, except for the fact that what the fuck am I trying to say? I will cut that out. Yeah. So we've talked about movement of the species and how it's successful, how it could be something considered like a neonative in certain parts of its range, spreading that way. But it obviously is not flying across the ocean. And also, it might be flying in betwixt different states and things like that, but it's spread at a massive scale. I mean, from when we discovered it at least to now, could you break down how it became invasive in other parts of the world, but also how it continues to spread in a anthropocentric lens?
Yes, I can definitely do that. So one of the reasons that it spreads so prolifically and continues to spread is because of ornamental trees and also because of people cutting ash logs and then moving them. Unfortunately, that happens very often. However, the quarantine that we had for emerald ash borer was actually lifted last year. And this is largely because it wasn't helpful. We really made a lot of these quarantine programs so that we could prevent the spread and help the lumber and timber industries. But because of the quarantine on like nearly every single county in any state where they were found, it wasn't practical. They couldn't ship or move wood like they needed to, and so we lifted the ban. The reason that we did that is because biological control is a lot more effective, that we're finding from our research, and so we just decided to scrap the ban altogether and put funding where it matters. In terms of a global scale for their invasiveness, I don't really know how they're traveling, like from or into Ukraine from Russia, for example, but they could be flying. They do fly fairly far, especially mated females, and so that's probably partly why they would spread into Ukraine would be my guess, but I couldn't say for sure.
Right. Okay. So yeah, they're really, really strong flyers, but the main thing at the end of the day is that we're moving lumber around and ornamental trees.
Right.
Oh, okay.
And on top of that too, a lot of people they don't want to cut down their ash trees because they like how they look, which I get. But the longer you leave them, the more of a population you're making, unfortunately. So when you have a really bad infestation, it's either best to chemically treat the tree if you can afford to do that, or remove it altogether.
Right. And once you, for example, like fall a tree, all of the larvae inside there are going to die, or some of them might pupate still. What's the deal with that?
That is a very good question. So if the larvae were not fully developed, they would die. However, if they were pupating and you fall a tree, they will probably emerge after the winter is past. So that is also probably a huge reason why cutting ash logs for firewood is a huge problem, because people will just leave them sit and the beetles are dead and they will emerge, and then they have a whole new place where they can feast on ash to their heart's content. So yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, so they're dormant over winter and then they come out in the spring as beetles. Right, so that makes it super, super easy, because then they're so totally dormant, so they can be in dead wood, live wood, doesn't even matter at all.
Yeah, and we found from our research too that they're surprisingly resilient when it comes to that. So we can kill them for months as pupae and expect them to not come out, and they'll emerge. They do. We've had logs that we've left for over a year and they still come out. So the firewood is a huge issue. But also financially, it's just not feasible for us to keep trying to control that.
Right.
When I was a young boy.
Warthog. Oh.
When I was a young warthog.
Very nice.
My upstairs neighbors must love me. I worked at a nursery, and that was my first introduction to the emerald ash borer. I was like a young 16-year-old prepubescent. Well, I don't know about that, but I was a young boy, and I didn't know anything about plants or anything. And I was a pre-plant-bescent person. And
for fuck's sakes, Nicholas.
I was pre-plant-bescent.
I was pre-plant-bescent. I mean, pubescent is a term to describe the hairiness of a plant.
Yeah,
so we're
true.
So I was pre-pubescent in the fact that I didn't know that pubescent plants existed, but also that was my first introduction to emerald ash borer, because I remember that the nursery I worked at, all the trucks had "Don't move firewood, it bugs me." Yeah.
Yep. We have that all over our lab. I guess we just got all of like the excess bumper stickers. It's literally everywhere. I can't get away from it.
Perfect. But you should send us some of those stickers.
I'm sure I could do that.
That would be awesome. So
we can do a giveaway.
Ooh, that would be fun.
That would be fun. And then we could donate the proceeds to Becca's research or something like that.
All right. It's noted as something to look into.
Cool. So we've talked about essentially what the EAB is, how it's such an effective invasive species, how it's moving, how it's been distributed, how it became invasive in the first place. And right after this break, we're going to be talking about potentially one of the coolest types of biological control methods there is. So we will be back soon, and we hope to hear from, I don't know where I'm going. I'm going to cut this last part out, but we will be back soon.
I do the same thing all the time. I'm like, why, brain? What are you doing? Yeah. Where are we going?
It's not my brain that's the problem. It's my mouth that doesn't shut the fuck up. It just keeps going. It's just come back here.
Get back.
Thank you for joining us for the first half of this episode of The Anthropocene. We're going to take a short break.
The Anthropocene is an independent project by young ecologists hoping to educate and share interesting information about introduced species around the world. If you'd like to help us by sponsoring an episode, check out the links in the show notes.
And we're back.
Welcome back.
I tried to cut into you. No, I tried to cut in before you did the creepy "we're back." So
too bad. I'm doing it it's every single episode now. It's even creepier too because you can't see me, so you don't know when it's gonna. Welcome back.
I like can hear you get close, but I can't see it.
I'm actually just moving the microphone, just shoving it in front of my face. Right. So honestly, this is probably one of the coolest control methods that I can possibly think of, because as a standard, invasive species are usually controlled with like mechanical or chemical means, but very often we don't see biological control. And if we do, it fails pretty insanely. So
Yeah.
could you just, I have no background in this. I don't know if Kirstynn has any background in this. So could you just like throw us right into the deep end of the parasitoid wasps and stuff? Because that is just so incredible to me.
Yeah, so what we're looking for in a good parasitoid or a good biological control agent is one that's species specific, so it's not going to harm native species, and also one that is multivoltine, which means that it has more than one generation a year. The reason that we're looking for something like that is because, one, EAB kind of is prolific throughout the year, and so we want a wasp or multiple wasps that are able to attack it in all stages of its life, or most stages at least. And so we study 5 parasitoids. I specifically work on 3. Our parasitoids include 2 larval ectoparasitoids, which means that they lay their eggs outside of the larvae, not inside. And those are Spathius galeni and Spathius agrilli. They're braconid wasps. They're not very large. And I should say also, none of my parasitoid wasps can sting people. People get very concerned when they hear that like a lab is releasing wasps as an agent of biological control. But most wasps are not capable of stinging people that we're releasing for these. And they're also very small. Like the Spathius galeni and agrilli are about this. Oh, you can't see, right? Are like measurements like that too. I'm just gonna say they're small. I hate doing that stuff. Sorry. Anyway, they're small.
For reference, she's saying approximately the size of a thumbnail.
Yeah, there we go. Thanks.
There we go.
I hate like trying to, because I always want to convert it to metric, but I'm like, brain fart. Anyway.
Oh yeah, we do both, and I usually look it up before an episode and write it down. I don't want to interrupt your flow here, but this is like tangential, but also kind of, I think, something that could be important. I have to tell people all the time that pretty much the only wasp that they ever really have to fear, at least in the Midwest, is the yellow jacket, because that's the only one that's necessarily going to be more protective of its like nesting site or something like that. As far as like most of the other wasps go, I've never had any negative interactions with them. I've only ever been stung by yellow jackets, and they have stung me with a pretty significant vengeance. I had to go to the hospital a couple times.
They're full of rage. I think they're solely powered on rage, in fact. But most wasps you don't have to worry about. Of course, you can get stung by like paper wasps, but they really want to leave you alone. Same thing with like bald-faced hornets. Yes, if you mess with them, they will mess you up. But all in all, they want to stay as far away from you as possible. It's something with those yellow jackets, though, that I really do feel like they're just fueled by rage. They love to just seek people out and be like, I'm going to ruin your day. Have a fun time. But yeah, the parasitoids that I work on are not capable of stinging humans, which is lucky for us because I touch them and work with them every single day. And I have no risk of getting injured in that way. So that's good. The other parasitoids that we work on a larval endoparasitoid, that's Tetrascus planopennis. And then we also work on 2 species of egg parasitoids, and that's where the bulk of my work is. They're Obius primorskiensis, which is the only one that we do not have a permit for release, and then Obius agrilli, which is the other egg parasitoid. Both species of Obius are almost indistinguishable, but they're about the size of a 12-point period font. So like very, very, very small. They're incredibly small, but it makes it very lab efficient to work with these insects because they don't take up a lot of space.
Right. And people probably aren't even really able to even notice that they're around because they're so tiny. You wouldn't, you definitely wouldn't notice either species of Obius. And as for Spathius, they really stick to ash trees where emerald ash borer is, and they're usually spending their time on the bark, and they're so cryptic that I think if you weren't looking for them, you would not see them. Right. Exactly.
That's honestly super impressive.
Yeah, they're really cool.
Yeah, so, I'll just be the dumbass who asks, how does it work?
That's a great question. So the way that we recover parasitoids, to even look at this in the beginning, is we go to the beetle's native range or whatever the invasive species native range is. And then we will collect eggs, larvae, things of that nature from their native range, bring them back into a quarantine facility and allow things to emerge and just see what happens. And we do that until we get a parasitoid that we feel like would be efficient, and that is also species specific. So for EAB, we really lucked out with all of these options for parasitoids, and not only that, but they're all species specific. They don't impact native species from our research, which is why they're approved for release, and they do it really, really effectively and very well. We're actually starting to see huge recovery populations in a lot of our release sites, which is great. We don't seem to have any issues with establishment. The only problem that we sometimes encounter is that Spathius cannot handle some of the cold temperatures that are up in EAB's northern range. But aside from that, they are really, really effective. And basically what they're doing is laying their eggs inside either the egg or the larvae. That wasp larvae will hatch. It feeds on the EAB until it kills it. And once it's killed it, it's ready to emerge into adulthood and start the process all over again.
Wow.
Right.
That is pretty freaking awesome, to be honest.
Oh, it's so cool.
So
I love it so much. And we're really lucky to have such a well-working system, because you don't see that in a lot of biological control. Even if you are exploring all these parasitoid wasps, you often run into issues with, like, they don't work in this introduced range. They don't work in the habitat. They are not specialists. They're generalists, or their parasitism rate is really low, so it's not effective. But we really lucked out. I cannot begin to express how grateful I am that we were able to find this many parasitoids for this project. And this was before I started, of course, but it's a really well understood and developed system. And that really helps for efficient biological control.
Right.
Wow,
yeah,
you
that
are
has
just
the backup. Sorry, Nicholas.
the master of segues, because that goes right into the question that I was going to ask next, which is just more clarification, or just kind of like, so that I can put it into perspective with people, because I feel like a lot of people do have that negative connotation with biological control. I'll just use the obvious example, which is the cane toad, which did not work out very well. But this is a case where it's limited by the carrying capacity of the emerald ash borer, since it's so species specific to what it's parasitizing. It's going to only be able to reproduce and get as prolific as that population. And once that population is removed, then it will naturally reach its carrying capacity and die off. Correct?
That is ideally what we would hope for. Now, sometimes you can see species switch hosts or find alternate hosts. But usually if they do have an alternate host, they're not as efficient or effective. And so you can often see population die off as a result. So for these species, I'm really not anticipating that they would switch hosts. I hope they wouldn't anyway. And I don't think we really have to worry about that for a while, because EAB is so prolific. But that is a point for concern. And that is why the laboratory testing is so important. Like you mentioned before, a lot of times in biological control, years ago, they used to just bring things in and release them and hope for the best without laboratory testing. And obviously that has not worked, because a lot of these species are generalists. And then we see a loss of native biodiversity, which is terribly upsetting. We already are losing enough as is. So when we first brought these parasitoids to the US to do this research, we had them quarantined in labs for 5 years, and they were doing research in China as well to make sure that these would be good parasitoids for us. So we really worked so hard to make sure that we would not negatively impact our native biodiversity.
Right, that's so important. And in case anybody doesn't know about the cane toad scenario, we're going to do an episode on that at some point for sure. So maybe keep a lookout in the next couple months, and we'll do that. But essentially it just was something that was brought into as a biological control and went terribly, terribly wrong, because it didn't have people like Becca working really, really hard to make sure that there weren't going to be, I mean, as much as we can know that they're not going to be these really negative side effects. So
right. And there's always going to be unexpected occurrences that happen, and not everything can be anticipated by laboratory studies, because the field is a very different situation altogether. But that research is hugely important. So we've, and I wasn't the one who conducted that research. Obviously, that was a while ago before I joined the lab, but it's vital. You can't replace it. You need that before you start introducing species. And also definitely listen to that future episode on the cane toad, because that story is crazy.
If there's anybody who's an expert on that that's listening, hit us up.
I've at least got a few Australian people who said they would be interested in at least providing some background on the effects of that invasive impact over there. But consider this a really good platform for the representation that biological control can be a super beneficial means of invasive species control and eradication, because I think that there's just that negative connotation with it. But if everything goes to plan, and it seems like with the research that's been conducted and the things that you're doing right now, it's going to be beneficial without those negative repercussions that came from a lack of research in the past, then it's likely that it'll be successful. So when you're talking about biological control methods, obviously we have a lot of those negative connotations with them. But in this case, it seems like it could actually be more beneficial than traditional control method, because we've talked about chemical and mechanical controls in the past, and most of our episodes have a lot of negative impacts on native biodiversity, because the only option for a lot of control methods are we have to eradicate them by any means necessary, which also includes impacts on the native flora and fauna.
Right.
However, in your case, it seems like the impacts on the native flora and fauna are going to be exceptionally minimalized, if not non-existent.
Right, that's our hope. If everything goes according to plan, ideally we will not be impacting any of those native species because of this extensive research. The reason that chemical and mechanical control is not effective for EAB is, one, it's too time consuming. Two, you'd have to pay a lot of people to be able to go and perform those controls, which as we were saying before, funding is already limited, so that's not really feasible either. And so for biological control, the nice thing about it is, like you're saying, you don't have to remove ash trees or completely eradicate ash trees altogether. Ideally, we could save the ash trees, or at least save some of them, so that we're preserving native biodiversity, but also attacking EAB and getting rid of that altogether as well. Now, I don't think EAB is ever going to completely disappear, to be totally honest. That would be nice. It's wishful thinking. But hopefully we will be able to manage populations to the point where native species that rely on ash can also benefit from ash, and so can we.
Right. No, I think that's a great point to bring up, is that management doesn't have to be eradication. And most oftentimes in ecological restoration, whether it's insect management or whatever invasive species management you're doing, we're not looking for 100% eradication. Usually the highest we're ever looking for is a 99% eradication rate. And even then, after a few years, when you've reached that rate, it generally still, you get spikes. And that's just something that you have to accommodate. It's not necessarily all or nothing. What you're trying to do and other ecologists and things are trying to do is essentially make it into a manageable, recoverable state where we can, where it's not going to proliferate too much and the native community that it's affecting can recover, because at least to the point where it's providing its ecosystem services again.
Right. That's exactly our goal. And ideally, everything will go according to plan, and that will be the end result of all of this research and laborious work. But we'll have to see, checking in another 5-10 years.
Right. Well, we eagerly await the results of this, and we wish you the best of luck, and everyone who's involved in that sort of management, the best of luck, and hopefully that your research is going to be making great strides towards the reduction of this insanely invasive and destructive species.
Thanks. I sure hope so too. And I'll pass on the well wishes. Our lab is always really, we love the encouragement and support from the public that motivates us to do what we do. So thanks.
Absolutely.
So important. Along those lines, anybody that wants to follow along on the work, just in the show notes, we will have the different social medias for Becca and different ways that you can go ahead and get in touch. So just check that out in the show notes, and also through our social media, we'll have a couple things linked there. So if you want to follow along with the research, send your own words of encouragement, go ahead there.
I should also note that most of my social media is not EAB specific, and my personal passion is spiders. So if you're arachnophobic, just a heads up.
Thank you for that.
There are a lot of spider pictures out there.
Right.
So if you're arachnophobic, change your views on life.
I can. If you come to me and you're arachnophobic, give me like
buttons.
A month. I got you. Yeah. Just give me a minute. I'll show you Buttons.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, Buttons is a velvet spider. She's objectively the cutest spider in the world. Aww. And just about my whole pride and joy in the world.
That spider is cuter than me. It's so adorable. That was a horrible comparison because I'm not cute at all. But think of a very cute puppy, and you're wrong, because that spider is cuter than that puppy. It is so ridiculously adorable. I can't get over it.
I'm so happy to hear you say that.
Go to Becca's Instagram, and we'll have an opportunity for you to shout out all your social media and all that kind of stuff at the very end. But I'm plugging it for you right now. Bug Girl Becca on Instagram. Follow it. If you're not following it already, what are you doing with your life? You're not following Bug Girl Becca, and that's a mistake. So go follow her.
Let me teach you all about bugs. Let me make you love bugs. That's my goal at the end of the day. I just want everyone to love bugs as much as I do, which is a lot. So, it's going to be hard, but I want to do it.
That's
Right.
incredible.
And at risk of sending a ton of people to your DMs, she is my go-to person for when I find like an insect and I'm like, oh God, I have no idea. I tried my best to get it down to the order, but
You do
even
well.
with insects, like that's so difficult. It's ridiculously hard. It is. I am so glad that I'm interested in plants and herbs because insects are just the most biodiverse entity on this planet, and it's frustratingly difficult to get into them. So your amount of knowledge for the wide variety of knowledge you have, I know you're going to sell yourself short, but let me gas you up right here for a little bit. Her knowledge is so beyond like anything that you could imagine, because I talk to scientists of different facets and who study different taxa all the time. But when I talk to entomologists, I am so blown away because of my entire lack of understanding, because of the sheer diversity of insects. How many orders of insects are there? Do you know off the top of your head? I know it's a super specific answer.
Well,
specific
the issue is I knew when I went to school how many orders there were, but with insects, it's literally always changing. I think it's 24. I don't think it's changed. But with insects, the families are always changing. Species are always changing. The genera are always changing because a lot of it was done just by looks without DNA analysis. And now that we have access to DNA analysis, we realize that we were wrong, very wrong. So that's the other difficult thing about entomology is you kind of have to stay up on top of it all the time.
Things are changing all the time. Yeah.
And there are so many bugs out there too. Like most entomologists usually specialize in a group or, either a family or a specific genus or taxa or whatever it is. But I like them all.
So to put this into perspective for you nerds who don't follow like taxonomy or anything like that, how many orders did you say there were for insects
24.
roughly?
Last I checked.
24. So there's 24 orders for insects. For reference, because this is the only order I know, I think there's 10 for plants. So less than half.
Right.
Order is like a massive grouping in taxonomy. It's above family, which is above genus, which is above species, for reference in a general, easy to break it down, bite-sized pieces for you guys. So the fact that there are so many insects this is why I'm so jazzed up right now, is because when we think of plants, we think of being super diverse, and like a lot of people getting into plants are like, I have no idea. I would learn plants 2 times over before I would even get close to covering the amount of insects there are. And it's ridiculous to me. So I praise to you and any entomologists out there, because the amount of knowledge you guys have to know and like the differences in it is just so astronomical to me. And it blows my mind that people like you even exist, because why would you want to know that much information? How can you know that much information? I don't understand it, but I'm glad that we have people like you, and I'm glad that you're part of the network here, so we could reach out to you, so you could give us your amazing insight and knowledge. And also so that Kirstynn can talk about insects, because she tries to with me and I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That means so much to me. And I think entomologists everywhere, because we do know so much. I mean, we have to know so much, and you don't meet a lot of people who study insects. So when people do meet an entomologist, any bug question they've ever had in their lives that they've stored away all comes out at once. So it's great. I really personally love it, because people get so curious about insects, and otherwise they really wouldn't learn about them because it's so daunting. But there are some really great entomologists out there who try so hard to break it down into bite-sized information and make it interesting and exciting, because it's so important to know about the world around you, and insects are a fundamental part of that world. So I really personally just love sharing my love of insects and arachnids with people, because they're hugely important, and also because I do find them so interesting. That's why it's easy to learn about, because I care about it so much. If I didn't like insects, I think it would suck. But however, since I was in the crib, I loved insects. Apparently as a baby, I would grab spiders. And when I was 5, I met my great uncle, who was a botanist, and he saw me flipping rocks looking for bugs and was like, hey, you could be an entomologist. And I was 5 and I couldn't say that word. But I was like, I'll be whatever you said. And then I did.
That's a
And that just
beautiful,
never faded away.
super inspirational story for everybody. Yeah,
Right.
for sure.
And
yeah.
Becca's science communication is fantastic. I am
thank you.
a huge proponent of science communication, and for her to be able to reach out to both people who are super interested in entomology, but also people like me who have no idea what's going on in the world of bugs, and be able to communicate that information so thoroughly and so comprehensibly is also equally amazing, because it doesn't matter how good of a scientist you are. If you can't communicate that science to the general public and also your peers, then it really doesn't matter at all, because that's where you're going to get most of your support. So it's super important, and you accomplished it very, very well.
No, thank you. That means a lot to me. That's like the thing I try the hardest to do. So I really appreciate that.
Well, you do a great job at it. So we're pretty much down to the end. At the very end, we like to do a devil's advocate thing, and we touched on it a little bit, but essentially we just kind of want to ask you questions that you might get from the general public about management, and how, just the questions that you don't like to address, because these are questions
my favorite to address. I'm very excited about this.
Well, perfect. Yeah, so I don't have any written down.
No, that's okay. I guess one that I would be curious about is the quarantine that was ended for financial purposes and stuff. Don't you think that even if it's still kind of a more difficult thing to implement and more expensive, that it should still be done? Or why is it just had to be ended? Anyway.
So it's a very debated topic. Actually, a lot of us were very split as to whether or not to end the quarantine. I didn't personally have a strong say in it, of course, because that's more of the higher ups when it comes to this stuff. But
of course,
I think what it really came down to was where we're going to put our funds. And for us, we are seeing so much good data and results with the biological control that it didn't make sense to keep putting funds into a quarantine when it wasn't helping. I mean, the fact of the matter is the spread, we put the quarantine in 2003, so it was discovered in 2002. A year later, we implemented the quarantine, and it still spread to 35 states. It didn't matter. And so we decided to lift it for that reason, and also because we didn't really publicly announce. I mean, we did to a degree, but we're not like, EAB is not quarantined anymore. So some people might assume that it is and not move wood, which is great. And I'm still going to tell people not to move wood. I'm not going to tell them it's illegal, of course, because it's not. But I think that's a good way also to combat it, and just say how important it is not to move wood. Not that you're necessarily not allowed, but here's why. Same thing with the spotted lanternfly.
Oh my God, I thought I was muted.
All good, Nicholas. All right, perfect. So still, just because it's illegal doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Like, do your best to not move wood around, and let's focus our money where it's really working, which is with the biological control. Okay.
Because like you said before, like funding is so limited that it's more important to use it where it's effective rather than implement things that aren't really useful for us. So that's why.
Right.
Awesome. We are running out of time, but I came up with one last question for you, and then you can shout out everyone and everybody that you want to. So I'm going to be the douchebag here. So if there were less emerald ash borer, then wouldn't that mean there would be less impact on the ash trees, which means there would be less dead trees, but also less food for woodpeckers? And as we know, because of large-scale deforestation and things like that, could that possibly see a decline in the populations of woodpeckers?
That is a great question that I don't think we've really considered at all. I don't think that we would see a huge decline in woodpecker populations, but it's possible. I don't know how much they're relying on EAB larvae as a food source. Especially when it comes to reproduction, like if they're feeding it to their offspring, that could really impact whether or not those populations decline. So I couldn't say for sure, but that's something that's definitely worthwhile to research into.
Yeah, and I was wondering just regarding habitat as well, because you think you've got, the additional habitat, because if they're making a nest, it's going to be in a dead tree because it's easier to burrow into that cambium and stuff like that, and the heartwood that's rotted. So theoretically, if a woodland doesn't have good tree populations naturally, and it's affected by, let's say, just more living ash trees. But to kind of add on to what you said, I really don't think that it would be a problem because it's not like it's a predominant thing, part of their diet. But then
Right.
also, if there's more living trees, there's just going to be more trees dying of natural causes anyway. So I don't think it would necessarily have negative effects on it.
Well, no, I think that's a good question just because when you're looking at that narrow of a scope, it's hard not to see whether or not that would impact woodpeckers. However, woodpeckers don't just use ash trees and they don't just feed on EAB larvae, and they were here before EAB were. So I don't think that they would really experience a huge decline without EAB.
I put on a snapback so that I could ask the devil's advocate questions.
I love it.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for showing us.
Yeah, you really got to get in. You got to get in character.
Got to get into character. Awesome. I don't really have many other questions because like sometimes the debate round is for us to sort of look at like the positive sides of the species and, like why we should maybe leave it alone or why we should consider like not controlling it. But with something that is so prolific and so damaging like this, it doesn't really have this aspect. So I think we're good to say that was amazing, and I'm so glad you could join us today, and I learned a ton. So
I'm glad, yeah. Thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Where's-
I haven't done anything like this before, and I really appreciate you guys. This was
Well,
so
you just did it
casual
better
and
than
fun.
both of us.
No, oh my gosh.
Hey, speak for yourself. Just kidding.
All right, fine. You did it better than both of my personalities.
I'm just kidding, Nicholas.
Me
yeah.
and me.
Yeah, you did it better than all three of us, me, myself, and I.
Well, I appreciate that. Thanks, because I was really nervous. I'm like,
Well, it didn't seem like it at all.
Oh,
You're
we're
super
still
well
recording.
spoken, and
no.
you're clearly very knowledgeable on your study area, which is probably a good thing.
I would hope so, yeah.
Yeah. So before we go, because we're actually running out of time here on this meeting, do you want to shout out any social media, any projects you're working on, any people, family, friends, anything?
I sure, yeah. Well, I'd love to thank just all my family and friends and every mentor that I've ever had. I've been really fortunate to work with a lot of great people and learn a lot over a short period of time. And I can't, that experience is invaluable to me. So thank you to everyone in my lab and everyone who's helped me get this far. As for like Instagram and Twitter, TikTok, things like that, if you want to follow me, I'm at Bug Girl Becca on everything except TikTok. On TikTok, I'm at Bug Girl Becca. Someone took my username. So sorry. Also, if you want to email me with any questions, you're welcome to do that. I will give them my email so you can see it in the show notes. So I'm happy to answer any questions or insect IDs. I can happily provide that. It might be a little bit because field season is picking up. So I am very stretched for time, but I will do my very best.
All right, awesome.
Wow.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for, honestly, you're our first guest, but this sets a very high standard for guests in the future. Sorry for future guests who might be listening to this episode. But yeah, this was incredible. I learned so much. I mean, I felt like I couldn't have possibly crammed, you couldn't have possibly crammed more information into this episode. It's fantastic, and I think that anybody who listens is going to get a super well-rounded experience. So thank you for just taking your time to join us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you all really enjoy hearing about EAB. I hope you get passionate about biological control, or at least insects in general, and start looking at the world around you, because they might be small, but they are fascinating, and they are, you can never learn enough. There's always something else to learn about them. So get outside, get excited about insects.
I love
Awesome.
that. Great way to end it. Thank you so
Kirstynn?
much, Becca.
Thank you.
You want to wrap it up?
I think that's about it for us today. As I said, check out the show notes to follow Becca. Thank you for going through our first process with us as a guest. Thank you to everybody who is still listening to us, or if you're listening for the first time, thank you for tuning in, and go check out some of our other episodes. If you're just here for the insects, we do have an ant one. And if you're not, we have a bit of a variety going. So welcome to the Anthropocene. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming out today.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Anthropocene.
Be sure to follow us on all social media and feel free to reach out to us with any comments, corrections, or suggestions for future episodes or species you'd like to see us cover.